Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 18 of Pumpin Iron, the review series for Gran Turismo 6's selection of classic muscle cars. And in this episode we're featuring a pretty unique vehicle. It's a 1967 Chevy El Camino. It's a pretty popular car, and you can kind of see why. It does have a certain unique specialist appeal. As you can kind of tell from the look of the car, it is mechanically based on the Chevy Chevelle. In particular, this model is based on, of course, the 67 Chevelle, whereas the Chevelle that we have on the game is the slightly newer 1970 model. So although they're different models, you can pretty justifiably compare the two in terms of spec. So how does this car compare in spec to the other Chevelle that's on the game, but also, of course, by extension, to the other muscle cars? Because this vehicle is pretty unique in another way. It's one of the very few vehicles on Gran Turismo which genuinely spans two distinct vehicle categories. It is very obviously a muscle car, but it's also very obviously a pickup truck. Now you may be thinking, wait a second, why is this in the Pumpin Iron series? Why isn't this in the Heavy Hitters series, being a pickup truck? Well, the reason is very simple. This vehicle was not a pickup truck that was then turned into a Chevelle. It was a Chevelle that was then turned into a pickup truck. So it's a specialist muscle car, with the emphasis on muscle car. This is a muscle car first and foremost. So despite the fact that it happens to also be a pickup truck, we're featuring it in this series. So, that being the case, what does it have to offer as a muscle car? Well, it's, as the name suggests, powered by a 396 cubic inch or 6.5 litre V8. You can supercharge that engine up to a pretty healthy 828 horsepower and a pretty hefty 910 foot-pounds of torque. And I don't know about you guys, but I didn't find that surprising at all. This immediately strikes you as the kind of car which would have huge torque. Now, one of the things which gives this car some very distinct advantages on the surface of things to primarily the Chevelle, but also other muscle cars in general, is the fact that it's a pickup truck. It's only a two-seater, it has far less bodywork and therefore far less weight than the Chevelle. And the result of that is that it actually weighs around 100 kilos less than the slightly newer Chevelle that's featured on the game. That's a pretty good advantage, considering that in muscle cars, less weight is always a good thing. So this turning out to be one of the very lightest muscle cars in the game is a pretty good point to work in the car's favour. However, it's not without its disadvantages, because being a pickup truck, it has a very unusual weight displacement. The majority of its weight is carried over the front, but the drive goes to the rear wheels. And that creates some problems. Not having that weight over the rear means that the driven wheels, which in this case are of course the rear wheels, aren't grounded enough or as well as they arguably should be, and therefore putting that 828 horsepower and 910 foot-pounds of torque to the road is a little bit more of a challenge than with many other muscle cars. As a result, this car really loves to spin up its tyres. Now, muscle cars do anyway, but this one especially so. It's almost impossible to get it to turn a corner without spinning up its tyres. And that's a problem, because wheel spinning wastes time. It also makes you more inclined to lose control, counteracting that wheel spin. Also, having low weight over the rear creates the problem, of course, of drifting when you don't want it to. Now, you can add ballast, which does help, but my recommendation with this car, perhaps a controversial one, is don't race it fully tuned. Because as fun as it may seem to have a 910 foot-pound of torque car in 1200 kilos, it just doesn't work that well together. In a straight line it works beautifully because it's got little to no weight to deal with, but around corners it's just not competitive enough. It's very competitive, however, at between the 450 and 500 pp categories, and that is where I would recommend using this car. Interestingly as well, it has another very distinct advantage. Despite being a fully premium model, it is, alongside the Pontiac Trans Am, the cheapest muscle car in the game. Both this and the Firebird cost just 30,000 credits each. It also has another advantage, as if that wasn't enough, and that is power to weight ratio. Because the weight is so much lower than the Chevelle, the power to weight ratio is higher despite having less power at 688 horsepower per tonne. So the car has some very distinct advantages, but also some disadvantages. Overall though, it's a completely unique muscle car, a very specialist vehicle, which has some also very interesting body modifications, including a wagon-style custom conversion for the rear. So, like I said, I'd recommend using it for racing in the lower PP categories, but it's certainly a very fun car to drive when fully tuned. So, that's it for this episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.